The moment the pediatrician's receptionist smiled and said, "Your husband can bring her back for the follow-up," Vivian Ashworth felt the words hit her chest like a stone dropped into still water, because the man standing beside her, holding a feverish 4-year-old against his shoulder, was not her husband. He was her boss. And she opened her mouth to correct the mistake, but something stopped her, and instead she just nodded and said nothing at all. If you believe in second chances, in kindness that sneaks up on people who've given up on love, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House so you never miss a story like this one. Vivian had worked for Julian Marsh for 11 months as his executive assistant, a job she'd taken out of desperation after her divorce left her with half a savings account and a mountain of legal fees. Julian ran a mid-sized architecture firm in Denver, the kind of company that appeared in local business magazines with headlines about innovation and growth, but nobody wrote articles about the man himself, about how he came home every night to an empty house except for his daughter, Poppy, and a revolving door of nannies who never lasted more than a few months because raising a sick child alone while building a company was simply too much for hired help to absorb. Poppy had been born with a congenital heart condition, and though surgery had corrected the worst of it when she was 2, she still caught every cold that swept through her preschool, and those colds always turned into something worse, something that sent Julian's phone buzzing during board meetings with the school nurse's number flashing on the screen. Vivian remembered the first time she saw him take that call. His face had gone the color of ash, and his hands had trembled so badly he dropped his pen, and she had quietly picked it up, placed it back in his palm, and said, "Go. I'll handle the Kowalski contract." He'd looked at her like she'd handed him a lifeline, and something in that look had stayed with her long after he left the office. It became a pattern after that. When the nanny quit without notice on a Tuesday morning, Vivian was the one who answered Julian's frantic call and offered to pick Poppy up from preschool herself, even though it wasn't remotely in her job description. When Poppy had a fever spike at 2 in the morning and Julian didn't know which emergency room took his insurance, Vivian was the one who stayed on the phone with him for 40 minutes, calmly walking him through it, because her own mother had been a nurse and she still remembered the questions to ask. Slowly, without either of them naming it, Vivian became the person Julian called first, before his lawyer, before his business partner, before anyone. She told herself it was just compassion, the kind any decent person would offer a struggling single father. She told herself that even as she found herself staying late not to finish spreadsheets but to help Poppy with a puzzle spread across the office floor, even as she found herself memorizing which stuffed rabbit Poppy needed to fall asleep and which songs calmed her during a nebulizer treatment. She told herself that even as she noticed the quiet at Julian's temples growing heavier with exhaustion, and how much she wanted to reach over and smooth it away. The day of the mistaken identity, Poppy had woken up with a temperature of 103, and Julian, mid-presentation for a client who'd flown in from Seattle, had called Vivian in a voice cracking with panic. She hadn't hesitated. She left the office, picked up Poppy from the school nurse's tiny cot, and drove her straight to the pediatrician, texting Julian updates every few minutes until he abandoned the presentation entirely and rushed to meet them in the waiting room, tie loosened, hair disheveled, looking less like a CEO and more like a man barely holding himself together. The receptionist, seeing them arrive together, seeing the ease with which Vivian held Poppy's hand and the way Julian instinctively reached to take his daughter's temperature reading from her before even greeting the doctor, simply assumed. Family assumed family. And when the mistake was spoken aloud, so casually, so certain, Vivian felt Julian go still beside her, waiting perhaps for her to laugh it off, to explain. But she didn't. She just squeezed Poppy's small hand and said, "Thank you, we'll be back Thursday," and walked toward the exam room as though the words had never been spoken at all. In the days that followed, something shifted between them, subtle at first, like the change in light before a storm breaks. Julian started lingering in the doorway of her office at the end of the day instead of leaving a curt good night. He started asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with work, which park Poppy might enjoy on a Saturday, whether a certain movie was appropriate for a 4-year-old, whether it was strange that he still hadn't taken down his ex-wife's photographs from the hallway even though she'd left 2 years earlier and had, according to the last update he'd heard, moved to Portugal with a man she'd met on a business trip and had shown no interest in her daughter since. Vivian carried her own grief quietly during this time, the kind she rarely spoke of because it embarrassed her, The grief of a marriage that had ended not in explosion but in erosion, her ex-husband simply deciding one day that he wanted a different life than the one they'd built, leaving her to rebuild alone in her 30s when she'd expected to be settling into permanence. She had promised herself, after the divorce, that she wouldn't let herself hope for anything again, wouldn't let herself want a family, a home, a person who chose her every single day. And yet here she was, folding tiny socks from the dryer at Julian's house on a Saturday afternoon because she'd offered to help while he took a work call, feeling something dangerously close to belonging. The turning point came on an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind that could have passed like any other, except that Poppy, freshly recovered from her fever and full of the restless energy that only small children seem to possess, tugged on Vivian's sleeve in the middle of the office and asked, with the brutal honesty only a 4-year-old can manage, "Are you going to be my new mommy?" The office had gone quiet. Julian, standing near his desk with a coffee mug halfway to his lips, froze completely. And Vivian, crouching down to Poppy's height, felt her heart pound so hard she was sure the child could hear it, but she didn't panic, didn't deflect with the easy adult trick of laughing it away. She simply said, "I don't know, sweetheart. But I know I care about you very, very much." Poppy seemed satisfied with that answer in the effortless way children accept uncertainty, and skipped off toward her toy bin, leaving the two adults standing in a silence that felt enormous. That night, after Poppy had fallen asleep and the house had settled into the particular hush that comes after a child finally rests, Julian found Vivian in the kitchen, drying the last of the dinner dishes, and he told her something he hadn't told anyone, that he'd stopped believing, somewhere in the last 2 years, that anyone could want this life with him. The sick days and the school pickups and the constant low hum of worry that never fully switched off, and that he'd made peace with being alone because it seemed safer than hoping for something and losing it. And then he told her that for the first time since his marriage ended, he didn't feel alone anymore, not because of anything dramatic she'd done, but because of the quiet, steady way she simply showed up, over and over, without ever needing to be asked twice. Vivian set down the dish towel and admitted, in a voice smaller than she intended, that when the receptionist had called him her husband, she hadn't corrected the mistake because for one brief, terrifying moment, it hadn't felt like a mistake at all, it had felt like the truth arriving early, before either of them was ready to say it out loud. Julian crossed the kitchen and took her hand, not with the urgency of a man swept up in a moment, but with the careful, deliberate gentleness of someone who understood exactly what he was choosing, and told her that he wasn't ready to correct that mistake either, not now, not ever, if she'd let him spend the rest of his life proving it wasn't one. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share it with someone who still believes love can find you when you least expect it. And before we close this story, do us a small favor, type, "I believe in second chances," in the comments below, so we know this story reached exactly the heart it was meant for. In the months that followed, Vivian didn't become Poppy's stepmother because of a grand romantic gesture or a single perfect moment, but because of 1,000 ordinary ones, bedtime stories, fevers survived together, quiet dinners where laughter slowly returned to a house that had almost forgotten the sound. And when they finally did marry, in a small backyard ceremony with Poppy scattering flower petals in a path that led nowhere in particular except toward the two people she now called her parents, nobody mistook them for anything. They simply were a family, built not from what they'd lost, but from what they'd quietly, patiently, chosen to become.